Spectrum on Radio 1 FM 90.
Brought to you by Housing Finance Bank, a financial institution regulated by Bank of Uganda. Housing Finance Bank, we make it easy.
And ICEA Life Assurance at 55 years.
Your views, our interviews on Spectrum, Radio 1 FM 90.
A very good evening, listener of Radio 1. Welcome to this edition of Spectrum, coming to you live from the Storage Street in the Central Building. That is the home of Radio 1 FM 90. We are also live on our website, which is www.radio1fm90.com. You click on the icon with the word Listen Live. We are also live on the different radio listening apps, TuneIn, Afro Mobile, your TV channel, Radio Garden, and Stream Afrique. You can also find this radio station on your TV set. That is, if you have a DSTV connection, look for audio channel 897. If you have a StarTimes connection, look for audio channel 97. My name is Kenneth Lukwago Anderson, your host, and today we'll be looking at the current economic situation amidst the escalating debt burden. Now, recently, Bank of Uganda warned about the danger our country faces because of the rapid growth of its debt burden, which according to them now stands at 80 trillion shillings. That warning came after Parliament had considered and passed a 1.7 trillion shilling loan towards budget support. Shortly after, the government did present another request of 500 billion shillings to finance a digital infrastructure project. Now, the government, through that Minister of Finance, did indicate that they are cash strained because of limited inflows in terms of revenue. Most of the loans that have been undertaken by government are meant for infrastructure projects that they say will bring social and economic transformation in the near future. Now, the economists say the most unfortunate part is that the lucrative contracts for most of these infrastructure projects are being taken by foreign countries, which means there's little value added to the economy in the shortest time. Now, economists and policy analysts have urged Parliament to step up its oversight function and ensure that the funds borrowed are properly utilized. They have called for austerity measures and the thinking of the national budget. The same voices have been re-echoed by the opposition in Parliament. So today, we'll be speaking to two stakeholders to hear their views about the danger we face as our debt situation gets to another level, and also how we can cope with the current economic situation in our country. I'm joined on the line by two gentlemen. Dr. Fred Muhumuza, Senior Economist, Director of the Economic Forum at Makerere University Business School. He also previously served as an advisor at the Ministry of Finance Planning and Economic Development. Welcome to Spectrum, Dr. Fred Muhumuza.
Thank you, Kenneth, and good evening, our listeners.
Also on the line, we are going to be joined by Mr. Julius Mukunda. He's a policy analyst. He's Executive Director at the Civil Society Budget Advocacy Group. Dr. Muhumuza, let's begin getting your views about the current debt situation. Bank of Uganda has issued a warning that our economy faces, but also reports now that our debt situation stands at 80 trillion shillings. And this takes into account the recent wave of borrowing where we got 1.7 trillion shillings. What is your take about the debt situation and the warning being issued by Bank of Uganda?
Yes, thank you, Kenneth. I think this is not the first time we are being warned as a country about debt. These are conversations that have been around for 5 years or even more. So Bank of Uganda is only re-emphasizing what has been in the pipeline. Uganda began to receive warnings even before our debt ratios to GDP went to 40%, because a number of people kept saying, well, we are not yet at 50, so we still have room to borrow. Now, there are quite a number of issues about that attitude. One is you don't have to wait to reach your limit, because at that point you might get a critical need to borrow, like we all did. So when we saw COVID coming in and there was an urgent need to borrow, including first-time borrowing from the IMF after a very, very long time. I think we had last borrowed from IMF at the beginning, around 2001. or thereabout who hadn't found that need. So you get to a situation where there are emerging things that you must borrow for. So it is always nice to say, if my limit is 50% of GDP, let me not wait to reach it before I slow down the brakes, because at that point you may pass it and you don't have an option. So those warnings began early. But also, secondly, we kept saying that debt to GDP is a wrong measure and reason for why you should borrow. The whole reason you want to borrow is what are you doing with the borrowing? And also, in determining what you're doing with the borrowing, you should be speaking on the repayment. Are you doing things that will actually give your economy the ability to generate the taxes and then be able to pay back the loans you have borrowed? So in that connection, you don't want to take assumption that if I borrow and build a dam out there and do a railway there and do this one there, the economy will grow. Those assumptions need to be thoroughly worked through to make sure all the T's are crossed, all the I's are dotted. You are not actually presuming to have things that will look nice. I've seen people post pictures of good roads, and we're like, well, it's not the good road that actually will pay back the debt. It's what you do with that road. So have you also borrowed in a way that will empower the private sector, that will empower the communities to actually use that road to grow your economy? So in that regard, we said, let's shift now from mere posting of debt to GDP to actual liquidity indicators. How much of your tax revenues are being used to pay, to service your debt on an annual basis? If the Revenue Authority is collecting 21 trillion, of the 21 trillion, how much is going into debt service? Because that begins to speak to realities that one must factor into consideration if you are to pay back your debt. Because remember, in the budgeting principles, debt will take the first call on any money that URA will collect. So if that goes out, the second call on that resource is payment for salary. Now, none of those is yet to speak to the real delivery of basic services that actually grow the economy on an annual basis. You would have paid your employees, but your employees need non-wage recurrent, which is really the working capital. And every private sector company will know your balance sheet or your expenditure side. There are items you use to actually produce the goods and services that you sell. That is your non-wage recurrent. So while you have your human resource cost, you don't want to finish all your money and then you have non-wage recurrent as an empty box. So the debt repayment and debt acquisition strategy needed to look into those liquidity indicators. First of all, we have said you borrow to make sure the things you're investing in will actually grow your economy. There are no assumptions. The second thing is you're not going to run short of non-wage recurrent and payment of salaries, which are the very things that will actualize your capital investment that you did in the roads, that you did in the electricity, transmission lines and generation of power, and many other things that you have borrowed for. Now, the moment those are not addressed, and we haven't been doing a good job on those, as I've said, over the last 10 years or even more, you get to the current situation where even when you want to literally pay salaries, what is left of Revenue Authority is not going to be sufficient to pay the salaries. So you may want to borrow to pay salaries. Or if it has been enough to service your debt, you have paid your salaries, you have nothing left to run the rest of the economy, buying the drugs, buying the fuel that is needed for some agencies, administration of examinations, or things like you name, real basic things that you need to run the economy and to meet every other thing that actually makes an economy for people to feel it. Now, at that point, when you go into a borrowing spiral, that you borrow on Monday, you have to borrow on Thursday, you have to borrow on Friday, and then you are literally getting into what people define as a debt trap, that you only have to borrow to do and meet your basics. And I think that began to come through the moment we began to do debt refinancing. That instead of paying debt that has matured, you roll it over and you only concentrate on paying interest. That was the first trigger that we are beginning to get into an unsustainable situation since we can now only pay interest and not the principal and interest. Because if you do not net out the principal from your books, it keeps piling up interest payment, and you'll end up in a situation where we are. And all we want to say is you can never borrow yourself out of debt. You can't use borrowing to resolve a debt problem. Resolution of a debt problem would have to go back to what you're referring to, austerity measures. You have to get back to restructuring of government. Really, the things we did under structural adjustment program 30 years ago, to reduce the size of your spending is also a means of meeting the budget shortfall. And I think it is high time government to go in that way to say, I had appropriated a budget of 48 trillion. How do I scale it down? I cannot borrow because I promised to borrow. I must now begin to cut out certain items and reprioritize my budget even before the financial year ends. That, for me, is something we should not be running away from.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fred Muhumuza. There's a thinking from the side of opposition, some economists and policy analysts who actually think the government has not been transparent about the situation that we are in as far as debt is concerned, but also the state of the economy. Do you share that opinion that probably the government should be transparent and different people come on board to advise it on what it can do, or you think they can still maneuver and bring things to order?
I don't think it should be a position of the opposition or any other person. The government itself knows very well the situation it is in. And according to government of Uganda, at least give them the credit that they have published as much information out there. The budget framework papers, the government budget, and a lot of other pronouncements. All these laws we are now discussing them because of that transparency. Now, I think the challenge is on interpretation of that information and what does it mean. We have discussed before the budget was being appropriated a position from Parliament when the Parliamentary Committee actually took note that the government had surpassed a number of its own fiscal charter indicators. Now, that information was out there. Now, whether it was taken into consideration or it was ignored are the issues you want to be able to engage, to say to what extent are we realistic to the information that is available, both within government and in the public domain, to actually inform the decisions that we are doing. So, and that's saying what is the state of the economy. Of course, if the economy cannot raise the revenues sufficient enough to cover basics of the economy, then you want to look back and say, what did I get wrong in terms of the investments I did? Many times people will only run to URA and say, you failed to collect the revenues. But URA can only collect the revenues from an active part of the economy. Now, if the economy is shrinking or the economy is moving backwards into areas that are not active, and the very active areas are beginning to get less active, then even the Revenue Authority would have a problem. We have already said Revenue Authority does not collect money from buildings. It collects rental income. So if I have nobody paying rent, then you cannot have income that can be taxed.
Well,
taxes are consumption taxes. If people are not consuming, you're going to have a problem collecting those taxes.
Dr. Muhumuza, one of the things we have been reflecting on is the fact that in the first quarter of this financial year, URA actually reported that it had collected 5.4 trillion shillings, and it exceeded the target by 286 billion shillings. Some people have been wondering how that is possible given the kind of economic situation we are in. What do you think would explain that kind of situation?
Of course, you look into the URA collections, taxes are sometimes accruals. Now, let's not forget that when the COVID situation came 2 years ago, there were some companies that were told you can now defer payment of pay as you earn. Focus on paying the salaries of your people. Also, you'd imagine that if a company is struggling to find 1 million to pay staff a salary, but of the 1 million, literally 350 or 300 is tax, then you would rather allow that company to struggle to find the 700, which is a take-home for the employee, and defer the pay as you earn. Now, a number of companies out of the recent reopening of the economy and the situation that they were in, and it's not general to all, some companies were being able to quickly revert to their good times, and they have been meeting some of those obligations. So you want to get back and say, the current collections, are they for this particular period? Because some of these are actually arrears, URA also has gone back to find people who are cheating taxes, and they have made arrangements with them. And these are going back, some of them, 5 years in time. So while this money is being collected at this point in time, it does not all reflect the current economic situation for everybody. But also we know that the increase in some of the items we are importing, say if the shilling depreciates, some of the taxes are pegged on the moving average of the recent cost of the dollar. So people may be paying more money because of an increase, a change in the prices. But that does not reflect the general situation of the economy, that the economy is healthy. And I think one other thing people need to know, that the targets for Revenue Authority are now being set to reflect the situation on the economy. So it is easy that URA might hit a target, but that does not mean the economy is well. If you're talking about 5.4 trillion in a quarter, that may total up to about 21, 22, less than 22 trillion. But remember what was the target in this budget for the domestic revenues. You're looking at almost 25 trillion. So we still fall short of what we thought we would collect from the economy, because the economy has slowed down. You don't want to put that on URA. Now, if we do not revise down our expenditure, it means we are going to increase on the borrowing.
All right.
Beyond what we had planned.
All right.
And we need to address those issues.
Dr. Mumza, you say that we need to actually address our expenditure side of things. So as a government, what exactly would you advise that they cut down on? The things that you would say, this one is not necessary at this point, let's do away with it and save some money.
There are a number of things we had done during COVID. We had, as a country, cut down a lot of travel. Foreign travel, I saw that come back after the opening for reasons really you could not explain, because the number of things and the number of officers and countries had completely adopted Zoom meetings as a norm. Now, we need to revisit some of those. A lot of it is inland travel. You also want to get back to inland travel. Is it still so critical and needed? Now, you might even go beyond. Government was doing restructuring. That process is a little bit more slower than it should be, and yet it would release some of the resources and activities. Quite often, there are quite a number of things that you really want to defer. You want to go back into construction of transmission lines for electricity. Now, these are not going to speak to your growth within the next 1 year or two. There are things you can defer and say, fine, how do we leverage the transmission that has already happened? If somebody is going to do a factory, can we encourage them to build their factories in as much as it is possible? I know for some it may not be possible. To where we already have a transmission line, that the power is already within that vicinity. Move your factory there. We are still pursuing things of industrial parks. At this point in time, you can defer the industrial parks, because we already know some of those who have built are yet to give us the value for money. So these are some of the things you can defer, because as I've said, move your spending from some capital items and move it into the recurrent, because recurrent gives you growth instant. Capital is only circumstantial, but what is true about it, it is not going to give you growth within the year when you're establishing it. So if you really want to revive growth in the short term, we need to rethink our capital items that are guzzlers of resources and do not even 100% guarantee that after you have done them, you'll get the growth you are looking for.
All right, that advice is at the national level. What about at the individual level? How can we deal with that particular situation at a family level or individual level? Do we need also to rethink our finances?
A very interesting question and very, very pertinent. Because remember, some of the things we have said that government is supposed to do, they were being done for the direct benefit of households. Now, if government is not likely to do them, or there is an increasing likelihood that government will not do them, we have to shoulder them, me and you, at our own level. And we need to be cognizant of that. That there's going to be that time, or there might be that time, when you walk into a health facility and it has been happening, and all you find is the medical personnel paid for by the government. Thank you very much. But that person will write for your prescription and you're not able to find the drugs in the pharmacy because they have not been delivered. Now, that burden shifts to you as an individual. So thank God for giving you the doctor to make the prescription, but now you have to go and carry your own burden. So there are going to be a number of things that we need to know are coming our way as individuals And so we need to beef up our own resilience and savings, because the bottom line is about you. If that road is really broken and there is no lorry or vehicle that comes to your village anymore, what are you going to do when you have to get that child back to school? What are you going to do when you have to transport a sick person back to the school, or even to take your own produce? The person who has been coming there with a truck was benefiting from road maintenance. If the road maintenance budget of government has gone away, what are you going to do as an individual to still reach that market and sell your produce and meet your basics? So we've got to become very, very frugal and alert of what is happening around us, and know that there are more responsibilities that may come to us at individual level, and therefore we need to be very, very tight on how we spend our own money. If anything can be deferred as we're advising government, even us, we must defer some of these items.
All right, Isaac Mufumba weighs in the discussion, and he says, I don't think that government should be applying principles of economic to borrowing or stock debt. We simply need to apply common sense. We simply have to cut our coats according to our cloth. We should do as well as possible with the limited resources we have. Why think of funding infrastructure projects when you have no money? That's a comment there from Isaac Mufumba. And then we have Subi Henry listening in from Makerere, who weighs in and says, I appreciate Dr. Muhumuza's submission. What is his take on the current very high public expenditure with all the MPs, LOC 5s, LOC 3? I think the expenditure this is the kind of expenditure the government would look at. Why should we have 10 MPs in Kampala district, yet all the problems we experience in Kampala are the same? Your quick responses to those points there, Dr. Muhumuza.
I think the quick response is really on the public expenditure. There's public expenditure you can address in a short term. Now, you're not going to go and reduce the 10 MPs of Kampala in the short term. It certainly has to, we have to run with it up to 2025. But that said, there are certain items one can do. Sometimes some countries have done them, and we need to learn from them. You can actually reduce the number of sittings of parliament, but you cannot reduce the size of parliament in the short term or even medium term. But if you go back and say, well, members of parliament, we know your rate per day. Now, instead of sitting, I don't know how many days per year, we are going to reduce that by half. And members of parliament may recognize that. You do the same thing for councillors out there. As I've said, you can reduce the inland travels. I know sometimes committees of parliament have to go and inspect government projects. They can agree within themselves as matters of parliamentary procedures and say, instead of the committee sending 20 people, we shall send 5 and adopt their report. They will come and explain to us. So there are many ways in which we can, in the short term, make a response. But as I've said, the debt has taken us here out of decisions we have made over the last decade or so. So similarly, to reverse this debt spiral and the trend it has taken, we need to be looking at what things do we need to change in the next 3 years, in the next 5 years, and in the next 10 years. And that is where I think public expenditure is going to become very, very handy, move costs from personnel costs to the actual delivery of services to the population.
Well, Dr. Fred Muhumuza, I know you have an engagement in the next few minutes, but probably one last question to you. Do you think probably it's time for Uganda to go before its debtors and say, forgive us, we are unable to meet this and this obligation? Like you rightly said, we are spending much more on servicing the loans than we are spending on any particular sector in terms of growing our economy or investments through the national budget. Should we think about that option? There are some people who have said, let's go back like we did in the past. Probably they will have mercy on us.
It's an interesting question and a good conversation. The point is, who are you going to? In the last time we got forgiven debt, we literally went to the multilaterals, the likes of World Bank, the likes of IMF, African Development Bank. Now, the current crop of lenders are not that type. Some of the loans we have borrowed, we thought they were loans, but in the legal interpretation, they are actually not loans, so they are not even negotiable. A lot of money we have picked from the Exim Bank of China will not be treated as a loan you can renegotiate.
Well, China appear to be
money lenders, especially domestic borrowing. You cannot go back to those individuals and they agree. So they are quite a complex set of borrowers that conversation will be very limited, and the few who would accept it are not actually the biggest pain when it comes into debt service.